Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. We are in the middle of August. After Mrs. Pringle had returned to the fray, I opened Lucy's letter. It was dated February 12th, which showed how long it had been collecting the dust at the back of the dresser. In it, Lucy informed me that Mr. and Mrs. Ambrose B. Edelstein and their two grown-up children were to be in England for 3 months. They came from, here an illegible place name, possibly Minnesota, Miniver, or even Minnehaha, where they took a keen interest in education, and the professor had several degrees in the subject. They were such a nice family, I thought of Mrs. Pringle, and would be fascinated by a glimpse of Fairacre School, so she had taken the liberty of giving them my telephone number, and they would be ringing me to arrange a convenient day to visit. No need to put them up or get them meals, as they were planning to stop in Caxley, but she was sure I would enjoy having them in school for a day, just letting them have a free rein in talking to the children and looking through their work. She was ever my affectionate Lucy, and added a postscript saying that there was absolutely no need for me to feel that I must reply. I breathed a sigh of relief, for mercies received, calculated that the Edelsteins had now been safely back in Minnie-What's-It for several months, and fell into a blissful sleep. Mrs. Pringle and the lawnmower man brought me back to earth half an hour later, and life began anew. My Norfolk holiday was a great success. There is something about the bracing, salty air of that magnificent county, with its massive skies and pellucid light, which is wonderfully restorative. In the summer, that is. I have only once experienced really wintry weather in that area, and hope never to again. Such piercing cold, straight from the steppes of Russia, it seemed, had an intensity never met with in Fairacre, even though we are always telling each other that we live in a cold spot. On the way to stay with my old friend, and on my return journey, I spent a few hours in Cambridge, so dear to me, and renewed my delight with walks along the Backs, Parker's Piece, and Midsummer Common. August is not the best month to see Cambridge, or any other place for that matter, for the trees and grass begin to look worn and shabby, and the first glory of summer has gone, and the true fire and radiance of autumn has not begun. But to my devoted eye there was beauty enough and to spare, and I hung over Clare Bridge and watched the scattered yellow willow leaves floating gently beneath me with the same rapture which I felt in my youth. There is so little water in Fairacre, and I do not realize how much I miss it until I come across a river or a lake, or even a modest garden fountain, and experience that surge of joy for this most beautiful of the elements. But, as always, it was good to get back to my own home. Tibby greeted me with some hauteur. He looked upon my absence as dereliction of duty, and was not going to put himself out with a lot of fulsome welcoming. Later, if I did the right thing with offerings of rabbit or finely chopped pig's liver, he might condescend to accept me again. Mrs. Pringle had obviously been bottoming me in my absence, and the house shone. She had even put some sweet peas in a vase on the mantelpiece, a gesture which, from one of her morose mood, I much appreciated. Later, I wrote to my Norfolk friends and decided that it would do me good to walk to the post office. The evening was overcast, and it was sad to see how much shorter the days were growing. Already there were yellow leaves fluttering down from the old plum tree in the garden, and dahlias and Michaelmas daisies were opening in the border. Far too soon autumn would be upon us, and lovely though it always was at Fairacre, with its flaming beech trees and bronzed hedges, yet there was sadness, too, at the passing of summer and all its outdoor pleasures. Letter in hand, I opened the front door to find Joan Benson about to thread the parish magazine through the letterbox. "Come in," I cried. "But you're just going out." "Not really. The post's gone anyway, and this will keep till tomorrow." "Then I will. I've a stone or something in my shoe, and perhaps I can sit down and investigate." It turned out to be a nail, and we had a few minutes of amateurish hammering to try and remedy the matter. We found the activity extremely frustrating, as there was not room inside the shoe to maneuver the hammer. However, by dint of banging energetically, we effected a partial cure. "We ought to have one of those little anvil things," said Joan, "with 3 feet on them. Is it called a Cobblers Last?" I confessed ignorance. "All I know about a cobbler's last is that he should stick to it," I said, "but I never really knew what it meant." "Like so many sayings," agreed Joan, standing up to test her shoe. "All my eye and Betty Martin, for instance? Or right as a trivet? Or being on tenterhooks? This shoe's fine now, thank you. You could set up as a cobbler as a sideline to teaching, you know." "I'll consider it. I might need something to do when I retire." "You're not thinking of that yet, surely. Incidentally, will you stay here?" "I doubt it. By that time, I rather think this house and school will be on the market. Any sensible woman would have bought a little place of her own before now, but I'm afraid I've left it a bit late." Joan Benson nodded understandingly. "Well, I can sympathize. This house hunting is so wearing. I've had another week with my daughter searching for a suitable home, but the more I look, the less I like." "What exactly are you looking for?" "You may well ask. Something with no stairs, a ground floor flat or a bungalow, but I must have a little bit of garden, and ideally it should have some trees, and be the sort of private place where one can sit and ruminate without too many people around. The snag is, of course, that it's virtually impossible to find such a place. Barbara is very anxious for me to have an apartment in an old people's home near her. Lovely though it is, it's an old vicarage with a cedar tree on the lawn and even an old nuttery with Kentish cobnuts. One would be among a score or so of other old people, all individually quite charming, I have no doubt, but never alone." "I can understand how you feel. Do you like solitude, too?" "It's the breath of life to me," I confessed. "Perhaps it's because I'm with a crowd all day. All I know is that to come into this little house and to hear the clock ticking and the cat purring is sheer bliss to me. I can truthfully say I've never felt lonely in my life." "Well, I can't say that," admitted Joan. "When you've had a husband and children, and latterly my darling mother, always about the place, and then to be alone is not exactly frightening, but definitely disconcerting. I suppose the ideal thing would be to find a flat near Barbara so she could see me frequently, but not have me under her feet. She presses me sometimes to make my home with them, and sometimes when I get back exhausted from house hunting, I almost give in. But it would never do. It wouldn't be fair to her or to the children or to me, to be honest. Grandchildren are adorable for a time, but it's asking too much to have them with you constantly when you are getting on, and I'm quite sure the same applies in reverse." She picked up the basket containing the few remaining copies of the parish magazine. "I must finish my little job. Mrs. Partridge usually does it, noble soul, but she's away for a few days. You've heard, I expect, about Holly Lodge?" "No, indeed. I only came back from Norfolk a couple of hours ago, so I haven't caught up with the Fairacre news." "I think I've sold it. Henry Maughan asked me if his nephew David and his wife could come and have a look at it. A very nice couple. Do you know them?" I told her the little about them that I knew. "Well, they're now trying to sell their own place, which shouldn't be too difficult. Miriam knows them rather better than I do, and the marvelous thing is they hope Miriam will continue to live in the annex." "She must be very pleased." A little frown of worry puckered Joan's brow. "It is exactly what I'd hoped for, and I'm sure it will work out beautifully, but at the moment Miriam is now wondering if they're only being kind and would really want the annex for themselves. We've all done our best to persuade her that she need not have such qualms, and as she's such a sensible person, I'm sure she will realize that the truth is very soon." She began to make her way toward the door. "Do you sometimes find even the most straightforward people horribly complicated?" she asked. "Frequently," I replied. "Perhaps that's why we relish our solitude." Reg Thorne and his 2 young men were now back on the school roof. The dormer window was now recognizable, but still seemed to be giving the 3 of them a certain amount of trouble. In my innocence, I had imagined that the job might take about 3 weeks, with perhaps a few more days allowed for bad weather or difficulty in obtaining parts for it, and so on. But here we were, months later, and still no sign of completion. I never seemed to be able to catch Reg himself. I would see him in the distance from my kitchen window, but by the time I had walked across to speak to him, he had leapt into his van and driven off in a cloud of dust. Dodging irate employers, I guessed, was second nature to him by now. The young men were fast becoming as evasive, at least in making excuses. One was fair, with fast receding hair. This seemed sad, as he could not have been much more than 25. The other seemed to be covered in thick black hair. Head, beard, and chest were one luxuriant growth. Only his dark eyes seemed to be visible among this lushness, and it was he who usually answered my questions. His name was Wayne. "Well, it's like this, miss. The timber merchant's been closed for the holidays, and when he opened last week, he couldn't let us have what we wanted because he'd had a sudden order in from that new estate." It all sounded pretty weak to me, but there were any number of excuses, equally futile, that were trotted out in answer to my queries, and I began to give up. Wayne was a nice young man anyway, and I half respected his loyalty to Reg Thorne. He told me that he had been with him for 4 years and had learnt a lot. "My dad's in the same trade," he told me, "and when he gives up, I'll probably take over there." "Didn't he want you to work with him?" "Not my dad. Said he didn't want me under his feet while he could still do a day's work, and got me fixed up with Reg. Better for both of us," he said. "And anyway, I've promised to carry on when he retires." "And will he?" "Not before he's 90, I don't reckon. I'll be drawing my pension, I reckon, before he gives up." Wayne's father, I thought, seemed worthy of respect. Term began again in the last week of the month. The children, as always, appeared to have forgotten in 6 weeks everything that I had ever learnt under my tuition, but looked brown and cheerful and ready for the new school year. Miss Briggs looked equally healthy and almost vivacious. She gave me a large smile when I met her in the playground and included the 2 young men on the roof in her affability. The infants welcomed her with affection when we went into the school, and one of the smallest presented her with a stick of peppermint rock. "I got it at Beresford," he told her. "My dad took us there on his day off, and we kept it safe on the dresser ever since." Miss Briggs thanked him with such obvious gratitude that I thought it would be churlish to point out that it had obviously been sucked at one end. After all, I told myself, it was the thought that counted, and what were a few germs between friends. Chapter 9. September. I always enjoy the early part of the autumn term. The new entrants soon settle down, and it is good to have fresh faces in the infants' room. This year there were 4 new babies, and luckily all were good-natured youngsters who refrained from bawling when their mothers left them, but looked about them bright-eyed and as inquisitive as squirrels at all these fresh interests. For the last few years, we have tried to let the newcomers visit us for a half-day a week in the preceding term, so that they become familiar with their surroundings. This has helped enormously when they finally make a start at the beginning of the school year. It is a great strain on a young child to be thrust not only among large numbers of bigger children, but also into a strange building where each has to find his own clothes peg, his desk, the wash basins, and, most importantly of all, the lavatory. Miss Briggs seemed much more settled, I thought, and certainly better tempered. No one could call her enthusiastic or charming, but her general demeanor was much more cheerful. This had a good effect on her class, and I suppose that the change in attitude resulted from the mellowing influence of the unknown young man, and also the fact that she now felt more confident in her work after 2 terms of teaching. She was far readier, too, I was relieved to see, to remain after school when needed. Quite often she did not go until Reg Thorne's workmen finished at 4:30, and seemed glad to take on extra little jobs connected with the coming celebrations. Things were going well in that direction. Mrs. Moffat invited me to see Linda's Victorian dress, and I accompanied her from the butcher's, where we met one Saturday morning. In the room set aside for her sewing, there hung her latest masterpiece. It was a perfect replica of Miss Richards' frock of the early 1880s, as dimly seen in a faded photograph I had found among the school records. It was made of black woolen crepe, complete with bustle, and draped over a pleated underskirt of black satin. At the neck was a ruffle of white lace, and embedded in the snowy froth was a beautiful jet brooch. I exclaimed with admiration. "Well, it's mostly bits and pieces," she said modestly, though obviously pleased at my reaction. "The black material is from an evening frock of mine. The satin was a skirt lining, and the lace I had by me. The bustle is made of foam rubber, much more comfortable than the original horsehair, I should think." "And that lovely brooch?" "My grandmother's. It was the mourning brooch she brought when her father died. She also had a pretty little mourning ring made from his signet ring, but it was lost not long afterward." "Well, Linda's going to be the belle of the ball on this occasion," I said, stroking the costume. "Don't be too sure. I think young Patrick will run her pretty close. I've been helping his mother make a serge suit with knee breeches, Norfolk style, you know, with an Eton collar and bow tie. He's going to look absolutely splendid. The only difficulty is persuading Patrick that he won't look what he terms a proper sissy in it." "I'll work on that problem," I promised her as I took my leave. Mrs. Pringle arrived at school one morning looking unusually militant. I soon learnt the cause. "That niece of mine, that Minnie, that awful Minnie!" She gulped with fury, slapping viciously at a desk with her duster. My heart sank. Minnie Pringle, still known by that name, although she is a married woman, is the mother of several children, most of them illegitimate. In a weak moment, I once engaged her as a second charwoman, and the havoc she managed to wreak in my house had to be seen to be believed. Whatever had happened to Minnie, I decided now, nothing would persuade me to have her in my home again. "What has she done?" I ventured to ask her irate aunt. "She's been and left her urn, that's what. Had some sort of tiff last night and up and left him with all those kids." "You mean she left the children with Ern?" No, no, no. I wish she had. She's brought 'em all up to our place, and I've left her grizzling over the cornflakes. I told her straight she's to go back to Ern as soon as she's got breakfast down. What went wrong, do you think? Well, you know our Min as well as I do. She's come across that chap Bert again, and she was sweet on once. I remembered that Bert was the man who had taken up his abode in their house in Springburn. Rather naturally, Ern had resented it, and there had been ructions. But surely Bert's got a job elsewhere. Only laying gas pipes. He soon got done with that and made a pretty penny, too, at it. Now he's having a rest on the Social Security, and you know what they say about Satan finding work for idle hands to do? Well, he's found some with our Min and Ern's cutting up rough. At this moment, Eileen Burton rushed in to ask if she could pull the school bell, as it wasn't fair, the boys always done it. I was too surprised by this passionate plea on behalf of equality for women to correct her grammar and agreed to her request. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pringle, limping heavily, had taken herself to the infants' room to continue her onslaught on the furniture, and I shelved Minnie Pringle's problems to face my own. We were having a spell of unsettled weather. 2 days would be calm and golden, and the farmers would be wreathed in smiles as they fetched home the last of the harvest or busily baled the golden straw. Then 2 or 3 days of rain would follow, drenching the straw awaiting collection and filling our playground with extensive puddles, which positively challenged the naughtier children to play splash 'em in defiance of my veto of this game. I had just dashed across the playground through a shower at the end of afternoon school when the telephone rang. Elizabeth Maughan was calling. "I'm begging a favor," she began. "Fire away." "Well, I know you often go to Caxley on a Saturday morning, and I wondered if you could give me a lift. I'm going to Jenner's to pick up a christening mug. The christening is the next day, and Jenner's having kept me in suspense all this time. Our car's out of order, or I wouldn't bother you." I said that I should be delighted, particularly as I had a clock which had been waiting to be mended for quite 6 months, and I too would visit Jenner's with her. By 10:30 on Saturday, we were on our way, splashing through the streaming lanes on one of the wettest days on our changeable spell. "It really is annoying," said Mrs. Maughan. "All my roses are turning brown with the rain, and I'm doing the church flowers this Sunday, and was relying on roses for my arrangements. The most reliable flowers in the garden at the moment are marigolds, perhaps not quite right for church decoration." "Why not? Everyone likes them, and they always look so cheerful. I'd plump for marigolds every time." Perhaps I will, agreed Mrs. Maughan, but she sounded doubtful. There is no gainsaying, I thought, that the ladies who take their flower arranging seriously store up a mint of trouble for themselves one way or another. You've heard that David hopes to move into Holly Lodge? I said that I had. Henry was so grateful to you for advising him. He gets into rather a tizzy over things like that. But I did nothing, I protested. You let him bumble on to you, said his wife. It helped. He rang David straight away, and he and Irene think it is exactly what they want. David can go to town by train quite easily, or on the motorway. He'll have to get a second car, but there we are. It will be good to have them at hand, and it will be so much healthier for them all, particularly for Simon. He's a frail child. I thought of the strength which had gone into the hurling of that quoit which had killed our dear albino robin, but said nothing. Of course, Joan Benson has to find somewhere, and David is still advertising his place, but we hope the move can be made well before Christmas. At a pinch, they can move in with us temporarily, but we hope it won't come to that. It wouldn't please any of us, and between ourselves, I think poor Henry would go mad. I jammed on the brakes to avoid a suicidal pheasant who strutted with great dignity and deliberation across the road in front of us. Of course, continued Elizabeth when we drove on, you are so lucky having a place of your own. I imagine you will stay on there when you retire? I explained my position. So what will you do? I hadn't realized that the schoolhouse was virtually a tied cottage. Oh, something will turn up, I said with a cheerfulness I did not feel. Well, here we are, and miracles will never cease. There's actually a parking space. Jenner's is an old-fashioned shop run in earlier times by the widow of the original jeweler, Edward Jenner. Although she is now bedridden, her two sons, who run the business, consult her over every transaction in the shop, which is somewhat trying if you are in a hurry. Sometimes a good bellow up the stairs suffices. A faint reply is vaguely heard by the customer, and one of the sons returns to cope with the matter, fortified by mother's help. But today, Mrs. Maughan and I had to wait while John Jenner pounded up the stairs holding 2 christening mugs. Time passed. We shifted from one foot to the other, studied barometers, clocks, wristwatches, dress rings, engagement rings, babies' spoons and pushers, rose bowls, and innumerable candlesticks. It was obvious that Elizabeth was growing even more impatient than I was. She had not had to put up with waiting for others, and is extremely forthright in her speech when crossed. I wondered what sort of welcome John Jenner would get on his return. Elizabeth's foot was tapping dangerously when he appeared at last. Your mother, Mr. Jenner, she said severely, reminds me of the Almighty, invisible and omnipotent. She's all of that, agreed John Jenner. Well, we'll follow Miss Reed through September next time.